Winter morning, 1945. Gravel crunches under boots as rows of captured German women stand stiff against the biting air. The sun hasn't fully broken through the mist, and the only sound is the rattle of a tin cup dropping to the ground. A young American guard steps forward, voice trembling with command and confusion. "Slap your own face," he says. "And cry." The line doesn't move. The women, former nurses, clerks, radio operators, stare back blankly. Their hands twitch, not out of fear but disbelief. They'd heard of humiliation rituals in Soviet camps, not in an American one. The camp flag flaps behind the guard, its colors muted by frost. His breath fogs as he repeats himself, louder this time. "Slap your own face." Around them, Camp Delta holds roughly 2,000 Axis prisoners, but these few dozen women are a rare sight among men. Reports say there were over 400,000 German POWs on US soil by the end of the war, yet only a handful were women. And this morning, those few are about to learn what captivity can do to a man's conscience. One woman, a field nurse named Ilse, looks straight ahead. She doesn't lift her hand. The guard's jaw tightens. Behind her, someone obeys. A faint smack cuts the silence. Another follows, harder this time. Then a sob breaks out, raw, involuntary, too human for orders. Ilse blinks but doesn't move. "Why?" she whispers in German. The guard doesn't answer. His hands shake slightly as he grips his rifle, the leather strap creaking against his glove. No one in the line can tell whether this is punishment, discipline, or madness. Maybe even he doesn't know. A diary later found in the barracks reads only one line about that morning. He wanted tears more than obedience. The women stand, faces red from cold and confusion. Some slap themselves again, softly now, unsure what the rule even means. The air feels heavier after each sound, each impact landing harder on dignity than skin. And when the guard finally looks away, the order lingers, unspoken yet alive. One woman lowers her trembling hand, refusing to cry. That single act will be remembered by everyone who saw it. And it's where the next story begins. The slap that never came hangs in the frozen air like a gunshot that failed to fire. Ilse stands motionless in the lineup, eyes fixed on the guard who just ordered her to hit herself. Frost settles on her eyelashes. Around her, the other women have started crying, some out of fear, others out of sheer exhaustion. The sound is uneven, chaotic. It doesn't sound like discipline. It sounds like shame. The American private, his name tag half torn, his voice already hoarse, steps closer. His boots grind on the gravel. "Do it," he says again, quieter now. Ilse doesn't move. Their eyes lock. For a second, the war disappears. There's only a man who's lost his nerve and a prisoner who's found hers. Another guard shifts his stance, ready to intervene. But before he can, a woman behind Ilse lets out a wail so real it freezes everyone. Tears stream down her face. She slaps herself once, twice, 3 times. The guard doesn't stop her. Maybe he wanted this. Maybe he didn't know what he wanted at all. The moment stretches thin. Ilse finally exhales, a cloud of white breath that rises between them. She lowers her gaze but still doesn't obey. Her refusal is quiet, almost invisible, yet it lands harder than any strike could. In the logbook that day, no disobedience was recorded. But every prisoner there remembered who didn't slap herself. Camp Delta, winter 1945, roughly 2,000 Axis prisoners, mostly men. Discipline infractions averaged 15 per day. This morning, none are written down. The guards act like nothing happened. But inside every woman, something has shifted, an unspoken defiance that no rule can suppress. Later that evening, Ilse sits on her bunk, face pale, hands clasped tight. The same guard passes outside, his silhouette framed by lantern light. For the briefest second, his stride falters. Maybe he's thinking of her refusal. Maybe he's wondering what kind of order demands tears. He wanted tears more than obedience, one woman murmurs in the dark. The phrase passes through the barracks like a secret prayer. Outside, wind scrapes the wire fence, a slow metallic sigh, and somewhere in that cold silence the same guard begins to question the very order he gave. Private Jack Reynolds couldn't sleep that night. The camp was quiet except for the wind rattling the tin roof of his quarters. He kept seeing the faces of those women, their hollow eyes, the trembling hands that didn't know whether to obey or resist. He had barked the order like it meant something, but now it echoed in his head with no purpose. Slap your own face and cry. What kind of soldier says that? Jack was 22, too young to have seen the world, yet too old to unsee what war had already shown him. He'd never fought at the front. He'd guarded warehouses, truck convoys, prisoners. The other soldiers called it soft duty, but the nightmares came just the same. Faces from Dachau, corpses from newsreel footage, images stuffed into his head by briefings that said, "Remember who they are." He had remembered. Too well. Jack sat on his cot, rubbing his temples. His rifle leaned against the wall, the leather strap worn smooth from his hand. Outside, a single light burned above the women's barracks. He thought about the one who didn't slap herself. Ilse, they called her. Her eyes had looked right through him. Not with hate. With disappointment. Reports say nearly 60% of American guards in POW camps were under 23. Most never saw direct combat. They were trained to command, not to understand. But Jack had begun to understand something dangerous. Authority without purpose corrodes the man who holds it. He reached for his pocket notebook. Inside was a picture of his sister back home in Ohio, wearing the same nurse uniform those women wore. He flipped it shut, ashamed. They could have been her, he muttered. The wind outside answered with a metallic groan, like the camp itself was listening. At dawn, Jack walked the perimeter fence, watching smoke drift from the mess tent. He passed the same lineup area where the order had been given. The frost hadn't melted. Footprints from yesterday were still frozen in place, silent witnesses to his confusion. Inside the women's barracks, someone began to sob softly. No command, no order, just human grief. Jack stopped mid-stride, head bowed. That sound would stay with him. He turned toward his tent, not realizing that what he felt tonight would spread by morning. The next morning, Jack sat alone in his tent, the thin canvas walls shaking with every gust of wind. The stove had gone out hours ago, but he didn't relight it. His hands hovered over a crumpled photo, grainy, official, taken during the liberation of Dachau. The bodies were stacked like driftwood, their faces erased by ash and distance. Jack didn't know those people, but the image had been burned into him by training officers who whispered, "Never forget what they did." He hadn't, but remembering had twisted into something else. He kept hearing Ilse's voice from the lineup. That single word she'd whispered, "Why?" It wasn't defiance, not really. It was disbelief, and Jack didn't have an answer that made sense anymore. The war outside was ending, but the one inside him had just started. In the barracks, a corporal was making his rounds, barking orders with tired cruelty. The sound carried through the thin air. Metal doors shouted names, a slap that wasn't self-inflicted this time. Jack flinched. He'd seen enough punishment to know that authority could turn sour, faster than milk left in the sun. Reports later showed that American forces liberated more than 30 concentration camps by 1945, each leaving its own psychological scar. Those soldiers came back broken, not from being victims, but from seeing too much of humanity's rot. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes. His fingers traced the Dachau photo like a wound that wouldn't heal. Maybe that's why he'd given the order. Not to humiliate, but to exorcise the ghost that kept whispering, "They did this." Yet as he replayed Ilse's stare, something shifted. The guilt was no longer one-sided. Outside, a bugle call sliced through the cold morning. Camp Delta was stirring again. The guards lined up, rifles gleaming under the dull winter sun. Jack slipped the photo into his pocket and stepped out, the frost crunching beneath his boots. He looked toward the women's section, half expecting to see her. Instead, he saw a new officer inspecting the line, his voice sharp, his posture colder. By nightfall, the same strange order would echo again across another barrack. But this time it wouldn't come from Jack's lips. It would come from someone worse, someone who believed in it. By dusk, the camp had changed. What began as one soldier's confused command had turned into a ritual. Every morning now, the order was repeated. Slap your own face and cry. The women lined up as the sun rose over Camp Delta, the frost biting their ankles through worn boots. The sound came in waves, smack, pause, sob, repeat. It was mechanical, hollow, and cruelly efficient. Jack had been reassigned to supply duty, but he could still hear it from across the compound. The rhythm carried through the air like factory machinery, emotion stripped, humanity processed. The guards didn't shout anymore. They just watched, Orders were orders. Inside the women's barracks, Ilse and the others prepared themselves each morning with the same quiet dread. They'd learned how to angle the slap so it wouldn't sting as much, how to cry without making a sound. Survival had become choreography. The Geneva rules pinned on the wall, about humane treatment, respect and dignity, had faded under layers of smoke and dust. No one read them anymore. Temperatures dropped below freezing that week, breath turning to mist with every word. Rations were barely 1,200 calories a day, thin soup, black bread, coffee substitute. The camp doctor noted declining morale among female POWs, though his report was filed under routine observation. Every blow landed on something deeper than skin. "They want to see us break before breakfast," Ilse muttered one morning. Her voice carried just enough for the woman next to her to hear and nod. It wasn't anger that kept them going. It was the strange cold pride of still being whole. Jack watched from the warehouse gate one morning, fists clenched in his coat pockets. The new officer, Lieutenant Harris, paced the line like he was inspecting machines, not people. "Louder," he barked. The women obeyed, the sound sharp against the winter wind. Ilse lifted her hand, hesitated, then did something unexpected. She whispered a prayer under her breath. A few others joined in, soft murmurs buried beneath the slapping noise. Harris didn't notice, but the women did. Something tiny, defiant and dangerous had been born right there among them, something no order could erase, and soon that whisper would turn into a quiet rebellion. The next morning, the slapping began again, but something was different. The sound was softer, slower, almost rehearsed. The women had found a rhythm that fooled the guards. Palms brushed cheeks lightly instead of striking. Some even timed their breaths, so the faint clap of gloves against skin echoed louder than the pain itself. What had been humiliation was turning into quiet theater, obedience in appearance, defiance in heart. Ilse had started it. The night before, she whispered the idea across the bunks. "They want to hear sound, not feel pain. Give them the sound." It spread fast, a silent pact sealed in darkness. By dawn, every woman knew the choreography. Slap gently, cry just enough, survive another day. When the guards assembled for roll call, they didn't notice at first. The winter air masked the difference. But among the prisoners, every half-hearted strike felt like a victory. Tiny victories, but victories nonetheless. Across the camp, disciplinary infractions were logged daily. About 1 in 5 punishments issued for mocking orders or failure to comply. But these women weren't mocking. They were reclaiming something sacred, the right to choose even the smallest part of their own suffering. Jack, now stationed at the supply depot, overheard 2 guards laughing about the show over at the women's yard. He froze. They didn't see it, but he did. He remembered that first morning, the trembling hands, the look in Ilse's eyes. Now he realized the order hadn't broken them. It had taught them how to resist. As the sun climbed higher, the performance continued. The sound of slaps drifted across the frost, perfectly timed. If you stood far enough away, you'd think discipline reigned. But if you looked closer, you'd see something else entirely. Smiles hidden behind trembling lips, eyes that refused to dull. One guard frowned. He noticed the rhythm was off, too soft, too synchronized. His boots crunched as he stepped closer. "Harder," he barked. The women obeyed, but the sound didn't change. Confusion flickered in his face. He turned to another guard, muttering. They both sensed it. Something was wrong, something they couldn't name. By the next morning, that doubt would become suspicion. And suspicion, in a place like Camp Delta, never stayed quiet for long. It happened on the 7th morning. The frost had hardened the ground to stone, and the women stood in formation, faces pale beneath their wool caps. The slapping ritual began as usual, gentle, synchronized, almost graceful. But this time one of the guards watched too closely. His name was Sergeant Blake, a man who believed rules were meant to hurt if they worked. And he noticed Ilse's hand wasn't landing quite right. He stepped forward, boots cracking the frozen gravel. "You!" he barked, pointing at her. The lineup froze. Ilse's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Blake grabbed her wrist and raised her hand higher. "Do it right," he said. When she didn't move, he did it for her. The sound echoed, one sharp, sick slap that cut through the entire yard. No one breathed. Even the guard standing behind Blake looked uneasy. They'd seen cruelty before, but this felt wrong, personal. Ilse stumbled, catching herself on her sleeve. Her cheek turned red, but her eyes stayed locked on him. Not broken, just burning. The officer in charge scribbled something in his notebook. Disciplinary correction. But nothing could disguise what had just happened. Reports later revealed that despite the Geneva Convention's guidelines, physical punishment of POWs occurred in multiple U.S. camps, always off record. Blake stepped back, panting slightly, like he'd proven something. The women stood silent, fists clenched at their sides. One whispered under her breath, "He wanted the sound again." Another muttered, "He's scared we aren't scared." Jack, from across the fence, had seen the entire thing. He'd come by to deliver supplies, only to witness the officer's hand strike a prisoner. His pulse spiked. The same guilt that had haunted him now flared into anger. He wasn't supposed to interfere, but his conscience didn't care about rules anymore. As Ilse wiped the blood from her lip, Blake barked, "That's what happens when you fake it." His words hit harder than his hand. The women didn't reply. They just stood there, breathing frost and silence. Jack dropped the crate he was carrying. The sound startled the guards, and when they turned, they saw something in his eyes they didn't expect, rage mixed with shame. What happened next would divide the camp. The crate hit the ground with a thud that sliced through the frozen air. Every head turned. Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of the yard, his breath visible in sharp bursts. Sergeant Blake glared at him, hand still half raised from the slap. "Private, you got something to say?" Blake's voice carried brittle and cold. Jack stepped forward. "Yeah," he said, low but steady. "That's not discipline." The women stood frozen, unsure whether to hope or hide. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Blake laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You forget your place, Private." "Orders are orders." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd heard that phrase too many times. Orders were what made good men do bad things. He pointed at Ilse, who still stood with blood drying on her cheek. "You call that order?" The tension crackled like static. Another officer, Lieutenant Harris, stepped in, his voice cutting through. "Enough!" His tone was clipped, professional, the kind that smothered emotion with authority. "Private Reynolds, return to your post. Sergeant Blake inside now." No one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop. Jack glanced at the prisoners, dozens of eyes fixed on him, half in fear, half in disbelief. He'd just done something unheard of. He'd challenged his own. Harris finally shouted again. "I said inside." The spell broke. Blake muttered something under his breath and stormed off. Jack hesitated, then followed Harris toward the command hut. Behind him, Ilse lowered her head, not in shame, but in silent gratitude. Inside, the confrontation continued behind closed doors. Harris leaned against his desk. "You think you're saving anyone, Private? You're just making enemies in uniform." Jack's voice didn't waver. "I didn't join this war to slap prisoners." Harris sighed, tired but unyielding. "Then maybe you shouldn't be guarding them." That afternoon, the paperwork came fast. Reassignment to Supply Division. Officially, it was routine. Unofficially, it was exile. Jack packed his gear in silence, while whispers spread through the camp. To some guards, he was a fool. To the prisoners, a ghost of decency in a place built to crush it. As night fell, Ilse looked through the barracks window and saw him walk away. The frost glowed faintly under his boots. Tomorrow the slaps would sound again, but the rhythm would never feel the same. Jack was gone by dawn. His absence hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot that never quite fades. The women noticed first. The guard who used to hesitate, the one who looked at them like they were people, not prisoners, wasn't there. In his place stood new men, colder, sharper, eager to prove they were tougher than the stories spreading around Camp Delta. The routine didn't stop. The lineup still formed. The slaps still sounded. But something invisible had shifted. Without Jack's conflicted gaze shadowing them, the women no longer waited for mercy. They began to find strength in each other. The humiliation that once bent their backs now hardened them into something unbreakable. Lieutenant Harris tightened camp rules. No singing, no talking during work detail, no unsupervised movement between barracks. Yet every night, faint melodies slipped through the cold air anyway. It started as humming, barely audible under the creak of the fences. Then words began to form, soft German lullabies, the kind sung to children before the war. The guards ignored it at first, thinking it harmless. But to the women, it was rebellion disguised as comfort. Inside the logbooks, Harris noted low compliance among female prisoners. He didn't understand that silence could be a weapon too. Over 1,000 intercepted letters from POWs across the United States mentioned the same phrase: "We are treated like ghosts." But ghosts, when remembered, have power. These women used that power quietly, sharing food, stitching torn clothes, humming to keep fear from rotting their minds. Ilse became their anchor. The red mark on her cheek had faded, but her eyes had not. "If we can't choose our freedom," she whispered, "we'll choose how to live inside the cage." The others nodded. That sentence spread through the barracks like fire catching on dry straw. Outside, the guards still patrolled, rifles gleaming in the pale light. But something subtle had reversed. The Americans controlled the fences. The women controlled the silence. Then, one grey morning, a courier jeep rolled through the gate with a new notice from headquarters. The war in Europe was ending. Germany had fallen. And those words would change everything at Camp Delta, just not the way anyone expected. May 1945. The loudspeaker crackled, and for the first time in months the guards didn't bark orders, they announced them. "Germany has surrendered," came the voice, flat but shaking slightly. The words hung in the air like sunlight, finally reaching a place that had forgotten what warmth felt like. In the women's yard, no one cheered. No one moved. The moment was too big, too fragile. Ilse stood in the front row, frost melting on her lashes. Around her, the others breathed in disbelief. They were prisoners of a country that had just stopped existing. Hours later, the order came down: repatriation. Processing lists, medical checks, travel records. The same hands that once held rifles now held clipboards. The women were told to line up again. Same yard, same gravel crunching beneath their boots. But everything felt different. No slaps, no tears demanded. Just names read aloud in English and German. And the sound of the gates unlocking. Reports indicate that nearly 380,000 German POWs were sent home between 1945 and 1946. For the women of Camp Delta, it felt less like going home and more like walking out of a strange dream they never agreed to enter. Some smiled faintly. Some didn't. Ilse just stared ahead, her heartbeat steady, her expression unreadable. Lieutenant Harris supervised the release, clipboard in hand, avoiding eye contact. He mumbled "good luck" once, as if the words themselves were an order. The women didn't reply. They walked past him silently, boots thudding against thawing mud. Jack Reynolds wasn't there to see it, but somewhere in the storage yard his old footprints still marked the frozen ground. When Ilse reached the gate, she paused. The wire fence glimmered under the weak spring sun. On the post beside it, someone had scratched a small phrase in chalk: "Don't forget who you were." No one knew who wrote it, but every woman who passed traced it with her eyes before stepping through. Beyond the camp stretched open fields, wind rolling through tall grass. Freedom didn't roar, it whispered, and as Ilse took her first steps beyond the fence, tears finally came. Not ordered, not forced, real, the kind no war could command. Tomorrow the camp would stand empty, but memory would stay behind. Decades later, an old woman sat by her kitchen window in Bremen, the late afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded a faded letter, one she'd written to herself long ago, back when the world was still cold with surrender. Her granddaughter sat across from her, curious eyes wide. "Oma," she asked softly, "is it true the Americans made you slap your own face?" Ilse nodded slowly. The memory was thin but sharp, like a scar that never fully healed. "Yes," she said, "and we cried because we were told to." Her voice didn't shake out of weakness. It shook from weight. For years she'd kept that story buried. It wasn't shame that silenced her. It was exhaustion. Too many people had wanted clean endings to dirty wars. By 1990, only about 18% of surviving German POW women had spoken publicly about their captivity. Ilse wasn't one of them. Not until now. She looked out the window, seeing something far away, frosted barracks, gravel crunching under boots, the echo of a voice ordering tears. "They were young," she whispered. "Most of those guards, they didn't know what they were doing. Some of them were just scared to feel." Her granddaughter frowned. "So they were cruel?" Ilse shook her head. No, confused. The word lingered in the quiet room. It wasn't hatred that hurt the most. It was how lost everyone was. On the shelf behind her sat an old tin cup from the camp, dented, polished smooth by decades of hands. She still kept it, not as a token of pain, but as proof that survival didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered through objects that refused to disappear. Ilse leaned back, eyes glistening. "He was different," she said after a pause. "One of them, he stopped it once. I never forgot that." Her granddaughter waited for a name. Ilse didn't give one. Some kindnesses are too fragile to pin down with words. Outside, rain began tapping against the glass. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like faint slaps against cold skin turned gentle by time. Ilse smiled faintly. "You see," she murmured, "we were told to cry. But one day the tears became ours again, and for the first time she let them fall freely.